Greetings, friends. I'm David Bender. Quick story from high school. When I was a junior in high school, we had to do our first big term paper or big research paper. And it was an American history class, and I decided that I was going to do it on something regarding the civil rights movement because the civil rights movement was already something so incredibly mystical in my mind and in my heart. I wanted to learn more about it. I heard about this Martin Luther King Jr., this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. fella, and I wanted to learn more about him. And so when I came to my thesis statement, my statement was something to the effect of the speaking abilities of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world, something like that. I said the speaking abilities. I was interested in his speaking abilities from the very beginning. I didn't know the word rhetorical skills at the time. I would say rhetorical skills now. And so as I got into the wonderful research that makes up the term paper, as I got into that research, I found that a whole lot less about his actual speaking abilities, his rhetorical qualities, than I did the civil rights movement and all. So actually, it transformed into a wonderful paper about Martin Luther King Jr. and his part in the civil rights movement. I wish I still had that paper. I'd love to look back on it and see what I had to say at the time. It was a very important time, a very important paper for me. It was that time, it was that year, it may have been that paper that transformed me from writing more like a middle schooler and much more like a college person or a college student. So it was very important. It was very important for many reasons. I've always been intrigued with and interested in the civil rights movement. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement. In fact, this is about the I Have a Dream speech. Before I get into the I Have a Dream speech, I'm going to first talk about the culture in that day. The culture, the Jim Crow culture of the South. I'm going to talk about the culture. I'm going to talk about the start of the civil rights movement, how it started, what role Dr. King played in the start of the movement and throughout the movement, some other movers and shakers and other organizations within the movement as well. Finally, we're going to get to August 28th of 1963. We're going to get to the time where he gave the speech, and we're going to talk about that speech a bit. I have a whole nother document with the speech all on there that I hope that many of you have. I am speaking this for the very first time to the students in my that I have not even met yet, the students in my public speaking class at York Technical University or York Technical College. It may be heard by other people some other time, but first of all, I'm talking to the students at York Tech there in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Now, in this little presentation, in this lecture, I'm going to go over a couple of things that I've already told you. I got it all the way up to the civil rights movement and into the speech itself. Then we're going to talk about after the speech a little bit, how it was, how, what the reflections were, what the reactions were to that speech. And finally, we'll talk about some more things that Dr. Luther King was doing there at the very end of his career and end of his life. As I say this, just about everything I'm going to say, just about everything that I'm going to say is from a book that I just read, got over Christmas this last year from a boy, and it is called I Have a Dream Speech. It is called Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream Speech. The Dream. It's actually called The Dream, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Speech That Inspired a Nation. It is by a scholar named Drew D. Hansen. So now let's first talk about the Jim Crow South. Talk about why all of this speech and all of this movement came to be. And it came to be because there was so much incredible racism in the day. At the time Hansen writes this book, I'm talking about back in the 50s and the 60s, so in 1963, when King gave this speech, there were supposedly 19 million African Americans in the United States. Of those 19 million African Americans, 12 million African Americans lived in the South. And I'm not saying everybody was racist in the South at the time. But there was so much racism and so much bigotry and so much hatred and so much treating the African American folks as second and third class citizens was just remarkable in the hate that was conjured up and the hate that was displayed during that time. It was just amazingly horrible. When I say amazingly horrible, I mean absolutely amazingly horrible. There were laws that were passed called Jim Crow laws, laws that were passed to keep, supposedly to keep the separation and to keep the African Americans down and to try to keep them poor and to try to keep them out of the mainstream of society in the day. Um, so 1963 is when this was given, this speech was given. 10 years before that, a whole decade before that, 1953, there was passed by the Supreme Court of the United States, or ruled by the Supreme Court of the United States in Brown versus Board of Education. What they did was they said this separate but equal facilities is not right and will not do. The gist of it was that the folks who went to the white schools, the white high schools, the white whatever schools had a whole lot more money and had a whole lot more opportunity, and frankly, probably were getting a better education than the folks who were going into the poor African American schools. And so Brown versus Board of Education said that will no longer be. And they've ruled against the segregation, and their rules should have automatically desegregated all of the schools in the North and all of the schools in the South. Well, now, 10 years later, when Martin Luther King Jr. is giving this speech, 10 years later, 1% of the African Americans were going to school with the white folk. 1%. All of the others still going to schools that did not offer them similar opportunities at all. 1%. And it wasn't just the school systems, it was also the voting systems. All these Jim Crow laws I talk about, there were all kinds of laws that were passed to make it more and more difficult for African Americans to vote, and easier and easier for the white folk who were over the education boards or over the voting boards or over the whatever boards to reign over them and to make it more difficult for African American folks to get registered to vote. Now, this was not in this book. This was in the movie Selma, if you saw that. But they had the person there at the very beginning who was there at the voting precinct trying to get registered to vote, and all of the shenanigans and all of the injustice that was done to keep that one person, that one African American woman, from voting. It was a huge reality at the time. Let me give you some round numbers. These aren't exact numbers. These are round numbers from my memory, if you will, that Hansen gave in his book. He said in one county in the South, I don't remember which county in the South, in one county in the South, there were about 7,600 white folk who were living in the county at the time. Same time, there were about 7,200 African American folk who were living in the county at the time. Of the 7,600 white folk who were living in the county, about 5,500 of them were registered to vote. Of the 7,200 or so African American folk in that county, one was registered to vote. I wrote his name down, Mr. R.H. Hightower, 92 years old, was the only African American registered to vote in that county. And so if the African Americans were kept from registering to vote, they would never have their voice heard. They would never have their place at the table. They would never have their place on city councils or in the mayor's office. And so that was a huge problem, the whole voting. Many other problems evolved and many other problems devolved. At the time, what does it say? About 2%, I think it said about 2% of the businesses were owned by African American folk at the time. There was about 1%, or maybe it was 0.1%, a very, very small amount of the banks were owned by the African American folk. There were no African American folk on the Supreme Court, none on the Federal Commission, none in high office, none who was mayor of any city in the United States. And we don't forget that according to the Tuskegee Institute, between 1982 and 1963, there were 3,000 444 African American folk who were lynched by the hate and by the immorality of certain groups and certain people at the South at the time. This is the world that was. Certainly, there is still plenty of racism today. Plenty of racism today. But there, not only was it so incredibly open and so incredibly intensively hate-filled in some parts of the world and some parts of the South, but you didn't have anybody calling them down on it. You didn't have African American folks didn't have a voice and didn't have the means to call them down on it. Had very few white folk who were calling the other white folk down on that. What a place and what a time to live, certainly as an African American back then. I don't know anything about that. I'll be the first to tell you that I don't know if you need an old white man standing up here telling you about the civil rights movement, but hey, here you've got one, and here is my opportunity. And so, in and amongst all of this, when and how did the civil rights movement begin? Most people say that the modern civil rights movement began on December the 5th of 2000. No, it didn't. Let me do that again. December the 5th of 1955. Got my mind in the 2000s. December the 5th of 1955. December the 5th of 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, there was a woman named Rosa Parks. And you know a lot of this story probably. If you don't know a lot of this story, then it is my honor to tell you this story for the first time. But you know a lot of this, but Rosa Parks was a part of the NAACP at the time there in Montgomery, Alabama. Time they had one of those rules, one of those Jim Crow laws that determined where people could and could not sit on the buses at the time. And you had some places in the back where the African Americans were supposed to sit and the white folk were supposed to sit in the other parts of the bus. Well, Rosa Parks was sitting there in a part of the bus and a white man came up and wanted her seat and she had had enough and she refused to move. She refused to leave. She refused. And as she refused, well, she was arrested and she was taken in. She was arrested and word got out of that arrest. It was like a whole alert went all over, especially the African American population, the African American community of Montgomery, Alabama at the time. And everyone was incensed. Everyone was incensed, including a fellow named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, let me back up. We'll come back to there in just a minute, but let me back up just a little bit. Let's go back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm assuming he was born. I know that he was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, he was not raised in poverty. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., his father was a prominent minister, a prominent Baptist minister at Ebenezer Presbyterian Church, right? Ebenezer Baptist Church, right down there in downtown Atlanta. It's a beautiful church. It's a historic church. You need to go somewhere. I've been to see that church several times. Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so, as a prominent Baptist preacher, as an admired Baptist preacher the day and at the time, Martin Luther King Jr. Grew up in kind of a somewhat of middle class life-ish. That is, he was not really in poverty. His father had a good job, paid some actual money. They lived on, I guess, what they might call a middle-class house at the time. I don't know. I have been on several occasions. I've been down to Atlanta to see all of the Martin Luther King Jr. historical sites. But at no time has the birthplace or is the house that he grew up in, at no time has that been open yet. So I cannot tell you what it looked like inside. But he did not grow up in poverty. He grew up a smart young man to a smart father and to a smart family. He went to college, went to Morehouse College, and then he went to seminary. I think it was Cruiser Seminary. Then he got a PhD at Boston University. As a part of all of this education, he studied a whole lot of Gandhi from India, a wonderful civil rights worker himself, of Mahatma Gandhi. And he studied a whole lot of his non nonviolent protest. That he took a real heart in that, in the nonviolent protest movement. And he pretty much, as far as I know, brought that nonviolent protest movement to the civil rights movement and maybe to the whole United States. So after he graduated from Boston University, he went and he took his first call. That is, took his first church there in Montgomery, Alabama. It was the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So he had been there for about a year. He did not really feel that he was the one to be called into a leadership position in this time and place because he had been there for such a short amount of time, but they saw a leader and they chose him as a leader. And so on that December the 5th of 1955, when an alert went all over, especially the African American community of Montgomery, Alabama, of what had happened to our dear Rosa, what had happened to Rosa Parks, and how that went down. Very quickly, a meeting was called. And it was a meeting that I don't remember, I think it was Holt Baptist Church. It was one of the other Baptist churches there in Montgomery, Alabama. My guess is it was the largest African American Baptist church in the neighborhood, that is in the city. And I guess that because there were thousands and thousands of people who showed up that day. I don't know how many were able to fit into the church itself, but out there in the churchyard listening in, they say were several thousand African American folks who were all stirred up, as they should have been, by this unjust treatment of Rosa Parks and by this unjust treatment that they'd been living with all of their lives. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was called to address that crowd. And as he addressed that crowd, as they sang the spirituals and they sang the songs and they sang of equality and they sang of justice, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered probably what was maybe the first modern civil rights speech in the United States. After that, they got together, the other Baptist pastors and other people in the community, they got together and they formed a very important organization. They formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Martin Luther King Jr., who hadn't been out of school that long, Martin Luther King Jr., who had only been in the territory or in the county or in the city for about a year, they named him as the natural leader of that organization. What did he do as a part of that organization? As a part of that organization, the first thing he did was organize a bus boycott. The idea being that the bus companies and the buses that were owned by the white folk, the white folk didn't realize how much, white folk didn't realize how much income they were getting from the African American folk who were riding the buses. And so the boycott was that the African American folks would refuse to ride the buses until the laws were changed to allow anybody to sit where they wanted to sit, and some of the laws of desegregation. So that lasted for a long time. Again, I go back. I'm trying to think of what movie it was. I think it was a movie called The Help. I think they were talking about that's in that era of the bus boycott. And so they boycotted the buses for 13 months. Martin Luther King Jr. organized all of that. A lot of the organization was trying to get people to their jobs when they couldn't go on bus, trying to get people to their jobs and home again. Finally, after 13 months, a Supreme Court ruling, the bus boycott stopped because a court ruling came down outlawing that desegregation. But my goodness, a civil rights movement was formed. And as a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. was right there in it and right there doing it all. Now, there were some other organizations, important organizations that were there as well. Let me read some of these off. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I remember I've got a book right there on my bookshelf by John Lewis, who was a very influential politician down in Atlanta for decades and decades, for 30 or 40 years, a very prominent national politician. And he was a part of that. And a part of what they did was they organized sit-ins. You've heard of these. I know you've heard of these. You go to a restaurant, and the restaurant is a white-owned restaurant, and they don't allow African Americans to sit there in the restaurant. If you want food, you can go around back, and they'll give it to you out the back door. But that was a part of the law and a part of the custom in many of these southern towns at the time. So John Lewis and others, and I'm sure King was a part of it as well, they organized and trained these folks in nonviolence, that they were going to go, they were going to sit at the lunch counters, they were going to order their food, and if they were refused, they were just going to sit and stay. And they did that. They sat and they stayed. Well, a lot of times the folks didn't like them sitting and staying. And a lot of times they were humiliated, they were dehumanized, and stuff poured all over them, kicked to the floor, beaten up. It was a part of it. Now, as I'm talking to you folks from York Tech, right there in Rock Hill, South Carolina, you need to know our part of this. Rock Hill's part of this as well. Right there on Main Street in Rock Hill, there is a restaurant, and at that restaurant, there were 9 wonderful heroes of Rock Hill who had a sit-in. They were from Friendship College. I'm not sure when Friendship College closed down, but they were from historically black university, Friendship College, known as the Friendship Nine. They sat at they sat at the counter, and eventually they were arrested. And when they were arrested, they were taken to jail. And usually what happened when they were taken to jail, people would get bail money together and bail them out. And so when they bailed them out, the county would get all of the bail money, and that's how it would be. They would actually get a little bit richer off of it. But these guys, for the very first time, I think, of the civil rights movement, these Friendship Nine refused to be bailed out. They stayed and they served their 30 days on the work crews, sweating and sweating. And in that way, in some way, they changed the civil rights movement, in that more and more people began doing that, choosing to stay in jail rather than get the bail. And it changed the civil rights movement, because suddenly they didn't have to have all of that money to bail everybody out. That was not in this book, I don't believe. That was not in Hanson's book, the Rock Hill part of it, but still a very important part, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Another one was the NAACP. Back in that time, the NAACP spent most of their time and most of their efforts in the courtroom trying to change the laws. Trying to change the laws through lawsuit and other means as well, but trying to change the draconian laws. We have another one called the Congress of Racial Equality. And a part of what the CORE did, the Congress of Racial Equality, a part of what they did was organize, they weren't bus boycotts, they were called the Freedom Riders, the international, not international, but cross-country bus rides, I guess, the cross-country bus rides. They were segregated. And so what these guys did, and John Lewis, again, was a part of that, what these guys did was they would get on the buses and they would ride, and they would basically be breaking the law, but they would stay on the buses and ride. Another Rock Hill story, when they stopped in some small towns, they stopped in Rock Hill, South Carolina one time. When they did, they got off the bus, and the African-American folk were just brutally beaten. John Lewis was beaten to within an inch of his life, right there in the fair city of Rock Hill, South Carolina. So the movement was running, and the movement was running hard, and it was running in many different directions, and they were seeing progress, and they were seeing victories. But by 1963, the movement had stalled a bit. What were we, 8 years into it, 8 or 9 years into it since 1955? The movement had stalled a little bit. And Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to find ways to unstall the movement. And so he decided to take the movement to one of the most racist places in the world at the time, or certainly in the country at the time, and that was Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama was ruled by a man named Bull Connor. Bull Connor was basically the sheriff at the time. And Bull Connor did not hide his racism. And Bull Connor did not hide his hatred. And he ruled with a strong wrong and a stiff arm. And if people got out of place, particularly if African American people got out of place, he would pounce on them hard. This especially was a place where a whole lot of dogs were loosened, or at least were turned on the African American folks, doing injury to them. This is the place where there were a lot of fire hoses turned on the people to dehumanize them, knock them over, and cause them all kinds of concern and damage. This was the place, well, probably not the only place, but this is one of the places where Martin Luther King Jr. went to jail, and he wrote a very important letter from the Birmingham jail that, hey, maybe we need to do another video on that. Not quite as famous as the Have a Dream speech, but it was pretty famous. So it was 1963, and all of these different groups, all of these different civil rights groups were doing all kinds of wonderful things and making some progress along the way and stalling along the way. Finally, a fellow named Bayard, B-A-Y-A-R-D, Bayard Rustin, decided it was time for them all to come together for some big event, some big movement. And so they decided to march on Washington. They called it the March on Washington for Jobs. And eventually the date was set for August the 28th of 1963. Now, leading up to that date, there were so many things going on to organize this and going on behind the scene, because this had not been done before. It continues to be done in some ways now, but this had not been done before. I mean, you had a whole team working just on transportation, trying to help people not just from around the Washington area, but from Birmingham, Alabama, and from Montgomery, Alabama, and from out in California, and from the Midwest, and from all over, to be able to get to Washington for that march. People left 3 days before on the buses, on the interstate buses, to get there to that march. And there was a whole lot of pulling back and forth as to who was going to talk and what was going to be said and what was going to be done, and all kinds of planning like that. There were certain speakers that were going to need to speak. That is, some of the leaders of these organizations here. The one everybody wanted to hear was Martin Luther King Jr. They had heard of him. Some of them had actually heard him. He had been speaking around for the last 8 years in many places, in many churches. He spoke at a wonderful place called Montreat, North Carolina, up in the mountains of North Carolina, which is one of my favorite places in the world. He spoke over at Wake Forest University, which indeed was one of my alma maters, and spoke a lot of places. He was the name. He was the figure. He was very well known at the time. So that happened. In the book, Hansen tells in the book, he tells all kinds of stuff about the precautions that were taken. I mean, they were really afraid of all kinds of violence, not from the African American folk, but all kinds of violence from the racist white folk who might come in and attack. And if they came in and attacked, oh my goodness, can you imagine? They were expecting, and I think had 250,000 African American folks there, so they had security everywhere. In the book, it said they had 40 FBI agents at the top of the Washington Monument to look out, and on the top of the Lincoln Memorial. And I'm not sure what on the top of the Lincoln Memorial there is to stand in. They had FBI agents everywhere. They had policemen everywhere. John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, had already signed two executive orders that would declare martial law on Washington, D.C. You understand what that means? Basically, to allow the army, the military, to come take over at the time in our nation's capital. They were so afraid of all the violence that could come. Thankfully, I don't think any of that violence came, but those were some of the precautions. And so the people came in from many directions and in many ways. And they came in over a number of days. Now, this was Washington, D.C., literally in the middle of the summer. This was Washington, D.C., a place that is hot anyway. So as they were organizing who was going to speak first, who was going to speak second, how much they were going to speak and how little they were going to speak, what was the time limit, eventually Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I will speak last." And everybody said, "No, you can't speak last. Everybody's going to go home. Everybody's going to be tired. They're going to be worn out. They won't be able to hear you. You can't speak last." But he did speak last. That was a joy unto itself. And it was a joy unto itself simply because by the time he spoke, the network newscasts were on. I didn't know this, but Hanson told me in his book. The network newscasts were on, and they stream. I don't know if you could stream in at the time, but they had cameras there, and they went to that speech, and that speech was not just heard by the 250,000 people who were there, went out to millions of people all around the United States. So now we are to the place of his speech. Let me now pull out his speech. Those of you from York Tech who are looking at this, y'all should have this piece of paper. I don't know if you can see it or read it or not, but this is the full text of the Martin Luther King speech. Very interestingly, it is harder online than you would think to find the full text of this. They cut it up, they cut it out, they change it, they change wording, they change all kinds of things. But anyway, I've got this, and I'm going to go through this a little bit. As I go through this, you see the numbers on the side. The letters on the side. I'm about to say I made these letters up. I really didn't make the letters up, but I made up where I put the letters, let's say. So as I talk about this, we can go section by section by section. Now, this is not the speech, this is the text of the speech. The speech is what Martin Luther King Jr. said. The speech is not a written thing. The speech is a spoken thing. So this is the text of the speech. But what he did was he wrote a text for his speech. And he had I don't know if it was over a number of weeks, he had a number of friends and a number of colleagues and others who had been getting together ideas of what he might want to say, what he might want to say, how he might want to say them. Thinking about how some of the best things that he had said before and some of the best things that he continued to need to say, what he needed to hit on and not hit on. So they had all kinds of ideas. Then when he got in Washington, D.C. on, I guess, August the 27th, the day before, he sat down that night and he wrote it all out. He wrote it all out. He wrote it all out. And supposedly, I think it said in that book that he didn't finish writing out the text to the speech until 4 a.m., I believe. And then he handed it over to somebody to have it typed for him. Now, as we think about this, we say, okay, now you're a public speaking teacher, and what you have told us and continue to tell us is that we need to practice. Practice, practice, practice. You practice every day that ends with the word day. Practice, practice, practice. Where was Martin Luther King Jr.'s practice? Are you telling us it's one of the 2 or 3 greatest speeches of all time? He didn't practice? Well, he did. Well, he did practice. He practiced for the last 8 years. A lot of the themes, a lot of the sections, especially toward the end of the speech, a lot of those sections, the ones that he had been working on, that he'd been delivering to churches and delivering to different places for many a year. And he had pretty well perfected what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. So he had not just been practicing for a couple of weeks. He had been practicing for a number of years for most of that speech. So he stands up. Let us go here to section A. He starts out 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand. 500 years ago, back when they were right in the middle of the Civil War, a civil war that did not end slavery, but began the process. The great American, of course, being Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest of all Americans. He's the one of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, say that a couple of times fast, that proclamation did not end slavery. It ended slavery kind of in a little part of the United States, but it did not end slavery, but it began the ending of the evil empire, of the immoral institution of the enslavement of African American folks. Now, the enslavement of African American folks was actually outlawed in the 13th Amendment, but yeah, So look at King. Martin Luther King Jr. King is standing here on the Lincoln Memorial. On the Lincoln Memorial, right there behind him is the huge, mammoth, wonderful memorial to Abraham Lincoln. And he's given this speech. Oh, what a perfect, perfect scene this was. And what a perfect illusion. So that's what he does a lot. One of our wonderful techniques for public speaking is illusion. You allude to something that is maybe kind of common, at least within the group that's listening, or common within the culture at large. Abraham Lincoln is one of these. He alludes to Abraham Lincoln. Then we go down to section B. He says, but 100 years later, the Negro, the African American, is still not free. Yes, the freedom was promised 100 years before, but now still not free. And then he goes into one of his times of repetition. And in his times of repetition, he uses a thing called anaphora, Anaphora. Anaphora is a good rhetorical device for everyone to know and for everyone to use, not all the time, but on occasion. Anaphora is where you repeat the first lines of a phrase, and then you end each of the phrases different. And then you repeat that line and the end of the phrase, repeat the first part or end of the phrase. And so this is his first one. Though the most famous one is the I Have a Dream one that we'll get to in just a little while. But that's not the only anaphora here in this speech. That is only one of 6. This is the first one. The first one is 100 years later. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and change. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of the American society. 100 years later, he keeps repeating. And why do we do that? Why did he do that? Well, he did that for one reason, because it's good to get into a rhythm. Good to get into a rhythm, and with that rhythm, you can bring the audience along. Second reason he did it is that if you have similar things at the beginning of phrases, you can't do this throughout a speech. You can't do this all the time. You can't do any of these rhetorical devices all the time unless you are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But another thing that it does is it makes it easy for the audience to anticipate and to hear. Okay, they know what's coming. They know what the beginning is. They know what the theme is. Now let's see how he plays that theme this time and again and again. We get to section C now. Section C, I would say, is probably the thesis of the speech, maybe section C and D, but probably the thesis of the speech. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. And how was that check written? Well, here is another illusion. I guess this is not really illusion. This is a cite. The sources that he is citing here in section C, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Those are some pretty powerful sites right there. And he's quoting them absolutely directly. And he's absolutely correct in saying that, yeah, 100 years ago, or even longer than that, I guess back in 1776, I suppose, for parts of this. But all of that time, these promises were made. These promises were made not just for the white folk, and actually not just for the African American folk, but for all the folk. What were the promises? You go down to section D, and it says, well, the promises are written right there where everybody can see the unalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And he's arguing and saying, this is what you promised us. This is what you promised yourself. This is what you promised everybody. This is what, I don't know if this is the right way to say it or not, but I'm going to just say it. This is what we are due, he was saying. This is what we are due. You wrote that check, that promissory note to us. Get to the end of section D, and he said, sadly, however, the check has come back marked insufficient funds. You have not made good on your promise, he says. Y'all have not made good on your promise, and we continue to suffer. So really the main theme or the main image around this first part of the speech, and actually a lot of which is a good part, a good amount of the part of the speech that he wrote beforehand, but is about the whole idea of insufficient funds and the whole, I guess, the whole image of the check cashing. And then what does he do? Then section E, at the very end of that page there, it says there is no time to engage in the luxury of the cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Part of what he is doing there is addressing what some other folks were telling him that he should be doing, telling them what they should be doing. Oftentimes, white folks who favored civil rights and who favored them getting civil rights, or the African Americans getting civil rights, oftentimes they would say, just wait your time, just wait your time. Don't kick up a fuss, it'll be okay. Gradually, you'll get your rights. And he's saying, no, it is not time to be gradual, and it is not time to be slow. Rather, we go to section 6, and what time is it? Well, we go into the second anaphora. And this anaphora is now is the time. Now is the time to make the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and the desolate valley. Beautiful words. Goodness gracious, he was a poet. The desolate valley's segregation of the sunlit path. Now is the time. Now is the time. Now is the time. What is he doing when he says now this is the time? Well, in our in our public speaking class, we have an informative speech and we have a persuasive speech. One of the tools, one of the rhetorical tools, one of the things that folks try to do in persuasive speeches is to make it all seem very urgent. It is very urgent that you buy my product. It is very urgent that you vote my way. It is very urgent that you do what I want you to do. And so here is Martin Luther King Jr., and he is raising the urgency, saying, now is the time. We can't wait. Now is the time. Let's get excited. Now is the time. Section G, going on. There toward the bottom of section G, says that there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the African American is granted his citizenship rights. Reminding folks that the movement has made a difference and that there has been a lot of unrest. You go back to another movie, you go back to Selma, and you watch the folks there in Selma walking across that bridge. John Lewis a part of them, Martin Luther King Jr. a part of them at the end there, the third attempt to march, and the brutality was horrible. And he is lifting that up, saying, look, we're not going to rest. We're not going to be tranquil. We're not going to do nothing. We're going to continue to protest and to make our voice heard. But then in H, look at the end of the first paragraph there in section H. He says, however, let us not seek to satisfy our thirst from freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Now, I don't know whether Hansen makes this analogy in his book or not, but I think what King is doing here is saying we intend to stay non-violent. We don't tend to let the hatred and the bitterness make us who we aren't. Now, there were plenty of other African American wonderful civil rights leaders like Malcolm X, like others out there who, what did Malcolm X say? One of the things he's famous for saying is ballot or the bullet. You either give us the ballot or we give you the bullet. And so there was a whole realm of folks and a whole another community of folks who weren't in favor of this nonviolence, but rather were ready to get violent if violence is what was needed. We go down to section I, another anaphora. When will you be satisfied? When will you be satisfied? You've heard people ask this before. When is enough enough? When will you be satisfied? And here he uses some of his most beautiful language and some of his most brutal language at the same time. This is another wonderful rhetorical advice to be aware of, and that is sometimes you have to really describe what is going on. Sometimes you have to describe the good of what is going on. Sometimes you have to really describe the bad of what is going on. Look at that second part. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Never be satisfied as long as our bodies are heavy and fatigued and travel and we can't stay in the same hotels and motels. Cannot be satisfied as long as the basic mobility is from smaller ghetto to a larger ghetto. Cannot be satisfied until we're as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs that says for whites only, naming so much of the stuff that broke their heart in the day and continues to break our heart as we think of it today and as people still live it out today. Then we get to the end, the very last part, right before section J, the very end. He said, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like the mighty flowing stream. And here is, I don't know if that is an illusion or it is more like a cite that was not properly cited. But here he is quoting the Bible. Here he is quoting the prophet Amos. And the prophet Amos was pretty mad about some of the very same things when he said this thing or wrote this thing from the very beginning. So another allusion, another citation he is using. Your citations are important. Your allusions are important. Continue to use them to bring the audience in. So now we have the last part, and not the very last part, but a part. So a part of when we get to persuasive speaking, a part of what we'll do is we'll ask the audience to do something. So here he's asking the audience to do something with yet another series of anaphora. He says, go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina. Not only is this anaphora, but this is probably considered parallelism. Parallelism is another wonderful rhetorical device in which one phrase is structured like the next phrase, structured like the next phrase, and the similar structuring of the phrases makes a rhythm unto itself and enables the imagination or at least the attention of the audience and is easy to hear and easy to follow. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina. Now, what happens next? Now we're about to get into the I have a dream part. Let me tell you what happens next. Dr. King had a friend, a lot of friends. One was named Mahalia Jackson. She was a very famous gospel singer at the time, sang other things as well. If you go back, if you watch that movie of Selma, Alabama, called Selma, there was one time when the things were not going well for Dr. King, and he was very, very stressed, and it was late at night, and he called his friend Mahalia Jackson, who was very famous at the time as well, called her, and she sang with a beautiful voice to him over the phone. Well, so she was a friend and had been a friend, and she had been a part of the movement, and she had been many places. She had heard these speeches before, let us say. She had heard parts of these speeches before. And as she's hearing this part of the speech, what she did, what several sources, including Hansen, says, is she was there not far from him, and he came to this point, and she said, tell him about the dream, Martin. And then he kept talking a while, and she said again, tell him about the dream, Martin. Now, there's no telling whether he could hear her or not, but it's at that point where he really drops the notes and his demeanor changes and his voice changes and his power changes and his anaphora changes, and he goes into the most famous part of one of the most famous speeches in all the world, telling the people about his dream, point by point by point, telling the people about his dream. Telling the people about the dream that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Again, another reference to the Declaration of Independence. Telling them about his dream of the red hills of Georgia, the son of former slave owners and the son of former slaves will be able to sit down together in brotherhood. The slave owners, the former slave owners and the former slaves sitting there around a table in brotherhood. I dream of one day that even the state of Mississippi, oh, look at the way he wonderful description, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression. That, my friends, is some good talking right there. It's in one of my favorite ones. As I'm talking about L4 here. I have a dream that my four little children. He personalizes this, my four little children, indicating my four little children are as important as your little children, as important as John F. Kennedy's four little children. I don't know that he had four little children, but you understand what I'm talking about. He is as famous. They are as important as any others. They are as deserving as rights as any others. He personalizes this, saying, I have a dream when my four children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Comes down and coming to the end of the speech, we go to section N here. In section N, I point that out because he has another illusion and or sight. Hard to tell if it's a sight if he doesn't cite it, but still he sings the very famous patriotic song that many people could sing right now. I won't sing it. Why not? My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. But he says this with all of his power and with all of his might, talking about the freedom that the United States has promised and the freedom that the African Americans are on that very day claiming as their own. We get down to section O and we get to anaphora. Again, this may be the last anaphora. I think this is probably the last anaphora. The idea of this, let freedom ring. Let the bells of freedom ring. Let the love of freedom ring. Let the justice of freedom ring. Let the hope of freedom ring. He didn't say any of that. That's me as a part of that, but where? All over the place. Let freedom ring, the Rockies of Colorado, the curvaceous slopes of California, and the Stone Mountain of Georgia, and the Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. And then look what he does with the last one. Again, going back to Mississippi. He had some hard times in Mississippi. Going back to Mississippi, he says, let freedom ring in every hill and every molehill in Mississippi. Not just on every hill, not freedom just scattered around on the hills, but on the hills, in the molehills, in these hills, in those hills, all over the land, let freedom ring in Mississippi. Now we get to the very famous inn. The very famous inn. In some ways, he is again making a reference to something that an Apostle Paul said there in the Bible about there will be no more Jews or Gentiles, there'll be no more women or men, there'll be no more Protestants or Catholics. It didn't say Protestants or Catholics in the Bible, but it says eventually the goal is that all will be one. And that he ends by a reference to one of the wonderful Negro spirituals, free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. That, my friends, is some good talking. That, my friends, is a wonderful speech. I have on occasion looked up and said, what are the greatest speeches in all of the world? Or at least in the English-speaking world. And this one is always first, second, third, fourth, and oftentimes it is absolutely number one. So we know it today as one of the greatest speeches in the world. How was it received and accepted at the time? Well, there were different opinions. Some thought he nailed it, and said exactly what he said. A whole lot of the folks who walked with him and who worked with him, who were his colleagues, said, you said exactly what needed to be said. You changed the world today. And in fact, I mean, you've got to say that the response was pretty good in some ways, in that the very next year he won the Time Man of the Year award. The very next year he won the Nobel Peace Prize the year after this speech. It would seem like it was received pretty well. Others were kind of iffy about it, and others didn't like it at all. Others said, no, we don't need a dreamer. We don't need you out there dreaming. We need you here working. We need you here leading. I don't want to hear about your dreams. I want to hear about what you're doing, was some of the response. And then there was some other response as well from other groups who didn't like the whole idea of nonviolence, who were ready to go with the bullet or the ballot. So there was a mixed bag from the beginning as to how this speech was received. Um, it eventually received what we might call uh, iconic treatment some 5-ish years later, a little less than 5 years later. We'll get to that in a minute. Uh, After the speech, and as time continued to go in 1964, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. Knew that there was a whole lot more work to be done in the South, but decided to go north, to go up towards Chicago, because there was a lot of racism and there was a lot of bigotry and there was a lot of injustice up there as well toward the African American folk. But it was a little bit different up there. Down south, what they basically wanted was A, voting rights, and B, desegregation, to be able to go where everybody goes, those basic rights. And the thing about those basic rights is they're very hard to get, were very hard to get, are still very hard to get, but at least monetarily, they don't cost anybody a whole lot. And I'm not saying there was a whole lot of money that went into the movement and supported the movement, but if somebody else votes, it does not cost you anything monetarily. If you have other folks in the restaurant with you, it does not cost you anything monetarily. But when they got up to Chicago, when they got up north, what they found were conditions, the conditions, A, of joblessness. So they needed to find jobs. They needed a huge job program, and B, so many incredible slums, and they needed a huge housing program. The problem is that to get that done, we're talking about the tens of billions of dollars. Now, tens of billions of dollars doesn't sound like a whole lot right now, but tens of billions of dollars was a whole lot back in 1965, 1966. And so the techniques and the means and the ways that worked down south simply were not working up north very well. I don't know how his life would, I don't know how that would have ended. Very interesting as to how that would have ended. If he could have broke the dam, if he could have done up the north a part of what he did down south. Um, as most folks know, it was in April of 1968. He went to Tennessee to support sanitation workers who were protesting, who were striking actually. And he said a beautiful speech, gave a beautiful speech on that day, probably the second most famous speech of Martin Luther King Jr. And on that day, I like to say, and this is not funny at all, but it's, the whole concept is funny, that he preached his own funeral. He didn't preach his own funeral, but when he got to the end, he was saying that I might not get there with you. We're going to go to the mountaintop, kind of like Moses went to the mountaintop. We're going to go to the mountaintop. We're going to go to the mountain. We're going to get to the mountaintop. I might not make it there with you. An indication somewhere in his soul, he knew that an assassin's bullet might be there. The next day, it was. The next day, he was killed by the bullet of an assassin. And at that point in time, the great Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the greatest martyrs in all of the world. At that point in time, this I Have a Dream speech became iconic. It became pretty soon thereafter seen as one of the greatest speeches ever given by one of the greatest speakers ever given by a man whose integrity, whose talents, whose thirst for justice, whose leadership abilities made a difference in the world all the way back, all the way back from the time he was born, but certainly from 1955 up to 1968, and continues to make a difference in this world today, and continues to make this world better today. That's my lecture on the I Have a Dream speech. It's now been 59 minutes and 23, 24, 25 seconds. So I'll come over here, I'll cut this off, and we'll be in under an hour. Thank you so much for tuning in.